Welcome to this video on Introduction to Advocacy. I am Dr. Imran and I am working at Ambedkar University, Delhi.
Hello learners, my name is Dr. Arundita Panjde and I work as a researcher in Pradhan. So in this video, as Imran shared, we will cover what is advocacy, like what is the concept of advocacy, how is advocacy related to sustainable development. Then we'll go on to understand policy analysis through a tool called policy cycle, and then in the end we'll sum up and exercise. So let us start. So what is advocacy, learners? Advocacy is just about speaking up for a cause that one is convinced about and is passionately motivated about. Now, speaking for a cause is directed towards bringing about change in any given state of affairs. So, speaking up is related to public policy. So, advocacy acts as the link between activism at the local and grassroots level and politics at the state and national or global level. So let us look at some definitions of policy advocacy given by academicians and theorists who have worked in the policy space. Policy advocacy is the purposive effort to change specific existing or proposed policies or practices on behalf of or with a specific client or group of clients. The second important definition of policy advocacy is it is any attempt to influence the decisions of any institutional elite on behalf of a collective interest. An institutional elite could be a government, a department, a minister, MP, MLA, a corporate, or anybody.
Now, coming to advocacy for sustainable development, when we say we want to champion the cause for sustainable development, we have to understand that it is a complex concept. It has multiple evolving definitions. So what began as the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs has now become a complex tri-level equilibrium. Here, the effort is to move towards what we call green economy through a conception called the sustainability equilibrium. Here, we are trying to achieve a model of development that is environmentally and economically viable, economically and socially equitable, and socially and environmentally bearable, like it is depicted in the picture that comes on your screen. Irrespective of how we define sustainable development, the core objective of this concept is to foster economic growth while ensuring social inclusion and environmental protection. Now, to be able to achieve and balance this trifaceted conception, we formulated what are called SDGs. Now, there are 17 SDGs and chapters previously and videos previously have mentioned them in block 2. Here we are going to show the complexity involved in the interlinkages and synergies and tensions between balancing economic growth, poverty reduction, and environmental preservation. Sustainable development requires to build consensus between all stakeholders that are involved, but figuring out the practical way to do so is the more difficult challenge. Now, in order to understand the complexity, let me give you an example. We might want to foster economic growth by building a dam or opening a mine. However, building a dam or opening a mine causes displacement of the poor and has serious environmental repercussions. Thus, it makes the balancing of the three requirements very difficult. Now, to have a very clear understanding is important when you want to champion the cause. So, it has to be pursued not only at an individual level, but also in terms of how we believe and behave as consumers and producers, and through public policy. Therefore, understanding the policy environment within which public policy is made, who designs it, the different stages involved in it becomes fundamental.
So now we'll talk about a tool which was proposed by the father of somebody known as the father of policy science, Harold Lasswell. He proposed this policy cycle model as a tool to understand the process of policy making and what all stages does a policy go for in its journey. So let us start with the first stage, that is the agenda setting stage. So what is an agenda? Agenda is any problem to which a governmental apparatus is paying some serious attention at any given time. So the example that Imran just shared about construction of a mine or a dam, the problem that arises from that activity is, say, displacement of population and many other issues. So that could be a problem that can become an agenda for the governmental apparatus. So then how a policy problem is structured and defined actually determines potential strategies and instruments that shape the policy development. So this stage, learners, is very important because we need to describe and define our problems in a very specific and useful manner. Also, educating and encouraging appointed and elected officials to recognize this problem and the agenda becomes very important at this stage. The actors involved in this stage could be public, could be interest groups. Interest groups could be anybody, ranging from academic partners, from universities or civil society organizations, and so on. Another important and influential advocates at this stage are media. Media plays a very important role when it comes to agenda setting. What is the agenda that the government should focus on? What should be the focus? And the activities, learners, in this particular stage, the advocacy activities could be policy forums, in-person meetings, advocacy through media, and also influencing public opinion.
Coming to the second stage of the policy cycle, we are at a stage where the agenda has been defined and has been taken up by the government. Now, the second stage, called the policy formulation stage, involves laying down various ways in which any governmental agenda can be resolved or addressed, and then figuring out the most cost-effective, efficient manner to do so. Because it involves weighing different alternatives, the actors involved in this stage are mainly the experts of the field. Now, these experts or groups of experts shape policy formulation by defining the various costs and benefits involved in each alternative. Now, here we look at three groups of experts that become important in defining and championing various alternatives that are being put forth. The first is called the epistemic community. Epistemic community generally refers to a group of people who have scientific expertise over the concern that is being talked about. A good example for this would be when we are talking about health policies, doctors form what you call the epistemic community, who through their medical science can tell you which of the alternative course of action should be taken as treatment. Now, epistemic community is a much larger body. A much smaller body is called policy network, which has regular interactions with the government agencies and governmental bodies in order to give their inputs for policies. So, for example, the epistemic community of doctors and their medical science-based knowledge constitutes a policy network called the Indian Council for Medical Research. It was the Indian Council of Medical Research which went on to shape the way in which we decided on how many days of gap should be there between two policy vaccines. A group of policy networks come together to form what you call an advocacy coalition. For example, various groups of actors come together in what you call the National Disaster Management Agency, which was responsible for implementing, executing the lockdown that happened during the corona pandemic. This was constituted not just of doctors from Indian Council for Medical Research, but also secretaries and bureaucrats from the Transportation Department, from Food and Supply Department, and many others. This is what you call an advocacy coalition. Now, based on this, there is a certain amount of clarity that at policy level, policy formulation level, you have experts as select group of actors who amongst themselves form different kinds of groups called epistemic community, policy networks, or advocacy coalition. They, in terms of their activities, give policy proposals, give information about the kind of impact that policy can have, and try to generate awareness among the target population. From the policy formulation stage, we then move on to what is called the decision-making stage. Decision-making stage is the stage where you have to choose from the various alternatives that have been put forth in the policy formulation stage to take a course of action. Traditionally, in behavioral theory-based decision-making, there were two kinds of approaches. One was called pluralism, wherein competing stakeholders on equal footing participated in the decision-making. The other was called corporatism, where the stakeholders had privileged access to the process of decision-making, and not everybody was included in this group. The third model of policy making in terms of its decision making is called the incremental model. Here, instead of deciding based on cost-benefit analysis, policymakers learn from the experiences of the previous policy and build incrementally on that policy. Therefore, they would here like to remedy the problem rather than pursue positive goals. Based on this, when we talk about the influential advocates, interest groups, lobbyists, and media become fundamental to the process of decision making. Here, in terms of activities, advocacy groups have to build support for the choice of alternative that they have. They have to bargain, compete, persuade, and compromise with other groups championing other alternatives in order to come to the policy that can finally be adopted.
So learners, after the decision making stage comes the stage of policy implementation. Here the attention shifts to the executors of policy decision rather than on policy makers. Now this stage, it begins by specifying program details, agencies or organization that would be involved in that program, and budgetary allocation to each of those programs. This stage also shapes the impact that the policy is going to have on the policy program. Like in the last stage you saw that in the decision making stage, a lot of speculation on what the impact could be from this policy are laid out. In this, that is narrowed down into specific impacts that the policy is going to have on the policy problem. Now, in terms of influential advocates at this stage of policy implementation, again, the interest groups, the experts, in other words, or the media play a very important role. In terms of activities, important activities involves tactics to influence the decision makers, such as protests and ongoing monitoring of policy implementation. Now, the next stage or the last stage is stage 5, which is policy evaluation. So, after a policy is implemented, we evaluate the policy. This stage involves monitoring and appraisal of results and outcomes of the policy initiators. This stage also involves identifying the possible impediments or challenges that was faced in policy implementation, in case the objectives were not met, and then measures are decided or determined to remove those impediments. Now, the results of evaluation, of policy evaluation, may emphasize reconceptualization of the policy making process, which can either lead to termination or redesigning of policy. So when I say that this is the last stage, this is not really a last stage, but at a stage which kind of gives rise to either redesigning of that policy or termination of policy. So there can be a new policy in a new shape that can arise from after this stage, or a policy can be terminated. So influential advocates at this stage of policy evaluation again are the expert groups, the interest groups, or the think tanks, and again the media. And the activities involved at this stage are partnering with advocacy allies and educating the new policy makers of the changes, of the results, of the impediments and recommendations. So this brings us to the end of this video.
Now, in order to summarize, what we discussed in this video was advocacy is about standing up, supporting and championing any cause but one needs to be aware of all the sides and concerns of that cause, like we explained in the case of sustainable development. One also needs to understand that fostering economic growth while respecting ecological constraints and ensuring social inclusion requires a balancing act towards sustainable development. The process of policy making is a long-drawn process, and policy cycle model allows one to make sense of its complexity and plan advocacy in a designed manner. To be able to advocate vis-a-vis a policy, one needs to have a sense of various stages involved in the policy making. And when we are talking of advocacy for sustainable change, it requires a change in attitude and behavior of people in general. One has to adopt deliberative ways of knowledge production and facilitate participation in styles of communication that are socially mediated and oriented by the community. Now, here is a list of references that you can look at for this video. These are the group of partners that we have worked for over the course of this course and in this video.
Thank you, learners.